Welcome to the Grief Cocoon podcast, where you'll hear open, honest, and thoughtful conversations on grief and loss, death, and life. In this episode, I speak to Thabani Tshuma, who is a Zimbabwean writer and performance poet. We have a really amazing discussion about things related to addiction and its connection to loss. And we also talk about the grief that comes with migration. And he finishes off with sharing a poem of his that's really amazing. So please listen to the end. Before you hear the episode, I just wanted to give a quick apology for the sound quality on my end. I couldn't get my microphone to work for some reason before we recorded, and so it's a little bit more unclear on my end, but I hope that you can stick it out and listen to the awesome insights and perspective that Thabani brings. Enjoy. Might start with asking, can you tell me a bit about yourself and the creative work that you do?
That's always a hard one because I'm like, who am I? um, I am a writer, poet, performer, and it's interesting because they all intersect, but I see them separately. Like even though not all my writing is poetry, and not all my poetry is performance, um, but they all kind of play together in the same realm. Um, yeah, that's me. Well, that's a part of me. It's part of what I do.
And I know that you have explored grief in your poetry, and you've explored other really interesting topics, and one is even addiction.
Mm,
I was interested to know whether, I guess we're just heading straight in, but whether you have seen a connection between addiction and loss and grief.
100%. I mean, on kind of the most obvious level, there is like the mortality rate of people who experience addiction. I remember because I went through a rehab center, and like when we were leaving or like graduating, when we were done with treatment, one of our counselors kind of joked that like, oh, the first thing you should do is buy a suit because you're going to be going to a lot of funerals.
Oh my
And
god.
it's one of those like bring you into the reality of the situation. It's like, yes, this is you've finished your treatment, this is good, but don't like forget the severity of the situation that you are in and the reality of the experience. And it's like that's just the truth. Like I feel like since coming into recovery, I know at least two people who have passed away like every year. It's like literally just a common thread. Some of them like super close, some of them like acquaintances, but it's yeah, there's no separating that. It's like where there is addiction, there is inevitably loss, which just comes with the territory, but is something to be mindful for and something that kind of brings that sense of gratitude for life. It's like, what are we gonna do with like the new lease on life that we've been given? And I think an aspect that's not as commonly talked about is kind of the grief of self. And I think for me that's the one that comes up the most because like Thabani in addiction and Thabani now are two completely different people, which is it's always like strange to me because it's like living two different lives. And like if people would meet me now, because I've been sober for like 6 and a bit years now. If people meet me now, and I can tell stories of like the old me, and people are just like, no, that's there's no correlation. That can't have been you. And a large part of recovery is kind of letting go of that person that you used to be, or rather the person that you thought you had to be. Because I largely see addiction as like a coping mechanism for life, um, and a coping mechanism for self. It's like I thought I needed to do this in order to get through the day, and then recovery is kind of letting go of all those parts of yourself, um, and creating new ones, rediscovering new ones. There's a nice like saying of like they call it recovery because like you are recovering the authentic self that you are. It's like it was never it was never gone. Like it was always there, but you just need to recover that, and bring that back, which I think is beautiful.
Yeah, wow, I haven't heard that before actually. Uh, yeah, I think it sort of feels, when I hear recovery, it kind of sometimes feels like an end point, but it's sort of, it's really an ongoing thing, you know? It's not a
Yeah,
destination, it's like a
it's a journey.
journey.
Kind of like grief, non-linear. And yeah, it comes in waves.
Yeah, yeah. So I was wondering, like, what do you think is misunderstood in terms of addiction and also like the loss that's associated with that?
Hmm, a lot. I don't know. I feel like the thing that jumps to mind the most is kind of that idea of moralizing, and saying that loss or even addiction itself can be good or bad. I mean, yes, they are contextual variables that need to be taken into account, and accountability that needs to be had. Um, but I feel like at the core, like it's that idea of loss, um, being a part of life. It's like it's never, well, sometimes it is, but it's usually not personal. It's like it's something that will happen to all of us inevitably. It's like life is finite. At some point, we will all lose someone we care about, and we will lose ourselves at some point. And I think, it parallels to addiction in that way of so many people are doing things. It's like back to the idea of addiction as a coping mechanism. It's like we're all coping in a different way. And it's rather to like brush stroke, these are the good coping mechanisms, these are the bad coping mechanisms. I think it's more prudent to just look at them all as coping mechanisms, and there are consequences. It's like more of, rather than a moral approach, a more action reaction approach. It's like, do this, this will happen. These are the consequences of action, rather than this is an inherently bad action, or this is an inherently good action. It's like they're just actions, and actions have responses, reactions, and consequences. Um, and looking at how we can deal with those, and which ones of those we are prepared to live with.
Yeah. And did you find that, I guess, I'm guessing like people around you might have known that you were going through recovery or dealing with addiction? Was there a stigma that made it harder for you to deal with um, the the loss that was part of that, or the kind of I hope that makes sense. Like,
Mm, yeah, definitely. And I think because then it like speaks to broader issues around like mental health and stigma around mental health. And I think a lot of it stems from just like a misunderstanding or a lack of information. Because like I come from Zimbabwe, and the culture there doesn't have as rounded a like a an understanding of mental health. So I think that was definitely a factor that played into it. But also kind of the social norms, and being young. It's like to stop partying and stop drinking when you're young. That's like people are like, what else are you gonna do? uh, it's I feel like it's so normalized as part of like youth and just part of being a young person to kind of like step away from that. I definitely found it very challenging. It's like, okay, where are the spaces where I can kind of safely have a good time? And I guess, yeah, just it's because the journey for me like meant a complete overhaul of life. So there was, a lot of loss of friendships as well. And it's like how do you tell someone that like you're not a bad person, but being around you is not good for me, and make that not seem like they're a bad person.
yeah.
It's like how do you kind of separate that and have those difficult conversations? I feel like that was one of the hardest parts for me, is like trying to explain that and to separate that and be like, this, it's not about you, but like for me and for like my safety and for my growth and for my recovery, I can no longer be in this friendship because we're the lifestyles that we're living are not aligned. um yeah, does that answer the question?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You kind of touched on the losses that, yeah, not only like, um, yeah, the losses that come through from addiction, but the losses that come
Mm,
in recovery as well. Because in order to like grow and to stay sober and to be the person you want to be, you have to sort of let go of some of the past connections that you have. Like, did you feel like there was a period of grieving those relationships, or yeah, how did you deal with that?
definitely. I feel like I'm still grieving those relationships like six
Mm.
plus years on. And I don't think it's something that ever really goes away. And I feel like that applies for all kinds of grief. I feel like it's something
Mm.
that stays with me and becomes a part of me, because it kind of is like shy of a complete memory wipe. It's impossible to kind of remove those parts of your life completely. It's like a song comes on and you're like, oh, I remember that time. A movie comes on and you're like, oh, I watched that movie with this person. Um, there's just so many like memory associations with people. And I don't know, I feel like everyone who's been in my life has either like directly or indirectly contributed to the person that I am. So it's like I can't really separate myself from that. And I don't think I'd want to, um,
Mm.
if there was a way to do it. But yeah, I feel like it's like part of the journey is learning to accept that. I think for me it's definitely made me more appreciative of change and more kind of attuned to change and like the impermanence of life and how, something doesn't lose its value because it ends. It's still had an effect. It still had a time where it was beautiful and at a time where it was enjoyable and at a time when it did like mean something or everything to me. And it can be that and end and we kind of move on to the next chapter of life.
Mm. And have you found ways to acknowledge that, like, or um, how have you? Yeah, how have you, like, I guess, acknowledged those losses and the grief and dealt with that?
I mean, I had the benefit of moving countries.
Okay.
So I think that definitely, I don't know, I feel like it helped that like a change of environment is good for
Mm.
starting a new life and go to the other side of the world.
That's the
um
secret.
that's a secret. It's like just go, just
Yeah.
leave.
And don't
um
come back.
yeah, just never ever go back. um but I think, yeah, it's coming to terms with it. I don't know. I've I don't know if I've dealt with it. I feel like I'm still dealing with it. And I don't know if it's something that ever goes away, but it lessens. I feel like
Mm.
it's even though like you said, there's those like that distinct difference of like the person's still out there. It's and it's weird because I think about I like parallel it to the grief of home because like I grew up in Zimbabwe, but the Zimbabwe that I grew up in no longer exists, even though the country is still there. It's like, and I'm reminded every time I go back. I'm like, oh yeah, things have definitely changed. This is not the same place that I have in my memory, in my mind, even though it physically is still there. And I think that kind of applies to people. And because I mean we grow, we change, so it's like the that relationship that I have or had with that person, um it exists in the past. And I don't know if that's just like me compartmentalizing things, but I think it's been helpful to kind of learn to accept that, like, yeah, that no longer exists. Like, even if I was to run into that person,
Mm.
it's like the person I run into isn't the person from my memories. There isn't they like they are, but they but they aren't at the same time. Because we both changed, the relationship has changed. Um, and kind of learning to appreciate that that part in its little pocket in the past for what it is, and let it be that. Let it be
Let it
past.
be, yeah. And I guess you've brought up the grief of, like, home, and you're now living, I guess you've been living away from your homeland for a while now. Has that come up for you in terms of, like, while you've been here, has that been an ongoing thing? It sounds like you've been back a few times, but still, obviously, the place has changed.
Mm,
And so, even going back, you probably still have, like, this, idealistic version of it in your head from when you used to live there that it's not
yeah,
matching up to. Is that right?
100%. Um, and I don't know, because I mean, I left what, 10 years ago, maybe more, like 12 years ago. Well, I left a long, long time ago. So place the place has definitely changed. And I think it's something that I've also kind of, or I'm learning to come to terms with, because I think for a long time I was really attached to that idealized version. And I was like, okay, I will go back to that and it'll still be there waiting for me. And I think there was like one trip like a few years ago where it really hit me. I was like, oh wow, this is not the place that I grew up in. It's like everything has changed. The places, like the physical shape and topography has changed. The people that were there aren't there anymore. It's like everything that made it what it was is no longer there. And I'm different as well. It's like it's that idea of like feeling like a foreigner in my home country. And I'm like, guys, I'm from here. um, and I think it was like a revelatory moment. I was like, this isn't the place that it used to be, and that's okay. And I think for me, that's when like there was kind of a mental shift of like rather than having this ideal to go back to, it was like, okay, how can I create an environment where I am that has those things that I loved about the place and has those things that made it feel like home. It's like, how do I create an environment that feels like home around me rather than home as a place that I can go to or will go to in the end at some undefined point in time. It's like one day, go back home. Rather like, yeah.
Have you applied that to where you are, like being here as well? Is that what you mean? Or like creating a sense of home wherever you are?
Yeah.
As opposed to sort of, yeah, relying on being in the place.
I'm trying to. Can't say I succeed all the time.
Yeah.
But it is a work in progress. I think I'm getting closer. I'm definitely, as time passes, I get closer to a place, a place where the place is home.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people either who have migrated or who kind of grew up with a different culture can relate to that, because for example, like in my case, even though I was born in Melbourne, I very much grew up in a very Middle Eastern household where we spoke another language, and my dad in particular is very traditional, and I grew up with values from my Syrian culture. So when I went out to like started uni and went out to different settings, like work settings, it was like a bit confusing because I was like, oh, this is very different to what I know and to my family, to my values that I grew up with, to what I've been told. And then it's like, trying to reconcile those two things.
Yeah.
Yeah, never really getting that clean sort of tidy version of it.
It never is.
No, yeah. So it's, yeah, I think it's like a really relatable thing, even though for you it's like an actual, a more physical place that you've migrated from. But I guess coming back to self and identity, how have you been able to integrate the parts of you that maybe existed in Zimbabwe where you grew up, and then the new Thabani who lives in Melbourne?
Yes and no. I definitely feel like it's still a work in progress. And I think for me, the hardest part is figuring out what to keep and what to let go of. And again, it comes back to kind of that recovery journey and trying to learn what parts of me can act in service of me, because I have one of those brains that's really good at tricking myself and making me think that something I'm doing is good for me when it's really not. So I think that's been the hardest, longest part, is like learning to trust myself again. And yeah, trying to figure out what actually who I want to be and what are the kind of variables that need to be in place for that to come into being. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really like poignant question, especially after loss as well. Like you lost someone that was really significant to you. You know, part of your identity is like the relationship.
Yeah.
You have it relative to them, you know, as a son or daughter, or as a sister, you know, brother or sister, whatever it is, and then it's like, oh, like, who am I now? So back to like, yeah, talking about recovery and identity, I was actually curious to ask, how have you managed to recover the parts of yourself that you want to keep after addiction? Like, in what ways have you recovered your self?
Myself. Oh, big question.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think it starts a lot with, well, for me at least, it started a lot with understanding why, the why behind me doing a lot of the things that I do and did. And it's like when I can step back and actually see why am I doing this? What's kind of the payoff that I'm getting from doing things, and seeing that, like, understanding that internal architecture of like decision making. It's helped me to make better decisions. I don't want to say better, make different decisions. Which, yeah, has been good for me, I guess. It's interesting because, like, back to that idea of story and everything, just being a story, essentially, the way I look at it is like I was living a different story, and now I have changed the story to one that is more aligned to me. And I guess it's like, at its most reduced level, it's just being a good person, you know, just being more present and more empathetic, and, you know, valuing myself more, valuing life more, engaging with the world in a more full sense, like allowing myself to feel the full range of everything, and kind of dropping a lot of the labels that I'd learned to attach to things and unlearning them, and kind of just like approaching things with a greater sense of openness, to kind of just take it one day at a time, as they say, and just take me one day at a time. I feel like, I don't know, if I look back, like when I look back, I'm kind of like, wow, I really took a lot of things seriously that weren't that serious. It's like, it's fine. Nothing. I don't know. Maybe I'm now a lot more nihilistic, but I'm just like, nothing really matters. It's relaxed. It's chilled. It's not that serious.
Yeah.
So that's been helpful, is to kind of de-escalate the red alert, high alert status of life where everything is it's
Everything's
now like,
important. Yeah.
yeah, it's not.
It's
It's,
not.
yeah, a lot of learning learning what is important and like redefining where I want to expend energy.
I feel like when I'm listening to you talk, it's like the, I guess your way of like the relaxed way of kind of looking at things. It sort of also maybe points to like a, not judging yourself for things.
Yeah.
Because I think when you're talking about taking things seriously, a lot of times like it's serious because we also take ourselves seriously and then judge
Seriously.
ourselves based on how we respond to things or what's happening, and we take it personally that it's like a
Yeah.
reflection on us and we're a bad person and
Yeah.
all of
The
that.
spiral goes on.
Yeah, and it's always downwards.
Yeah. Give me an upward spiral once, please.
Yeah, they're very rare. But yeah, does that ring true to you? Like,
Yeah, completely. Because I feel like it's a lot of it for me was like learned behavior. It's like I was not, I don't think I was born an anxious person. I think I learned to internalize like anxious perspectives and anxious ways of looking at the world. And like, I wouldn't say I'm cured of anxiety completely, but I'm definitely better equipped to like approach situations like with a more level-headed approach. Um, and yeah, a lot of it for me is kind of not taking things personally and just being like, it's not about me.
yeah.
I think that's a a large running theme in addiction in general, just like that perspective of I'm at the center of the universe and everything is happening to me and everything is a personal attack. So I must constantly be on high defense and constantly be in reactive mode. Yeah, so it's been a lot of learning that like, no, it's not about me. It's fine. And that's okay. It doesn't have to be about me.
And life happens sometimes. It just
Yeah, most of the time.
yeah. True. Um, yeah, that's awesome. So actually, I want to, before we finish, I wanted to touch on this show that's coming up,
Yes.
and it's, I guess, related to some of the things we've been talking about, but I think it's mainly around the grief of losing someone you love who's in your homeland or who's away from you.
Who's away from you. And I mean, not necessarily physically, but even like a cultural distance or just some, yeah, a distance related to being in the diaspora and being, coming from the migrant perspective. And I think that's like one of the motivators behind the show is that it's a facet of grief that isn't talked about as much, or there aren't many spaces where we can kind of experience that in its fullness, which is what we want to do. It's like at the very fundamental, it's a space for us to explore the grief that we live with and are living through, um, and kind of just look at that and be like, what does this mean for us? What does this mean to us? How has this shaped us? How has this changed us? What is it? What can we learn from it? Where can we grow into it? Does anyone else feel like this? And if you do, we're here, you know? It's like, yeah, I feel like the show more than anything will be like a healing experience for both us and anyone who comes to it.
So yeah, it's called Haza, and I'm
Mm.
saying it in the
In
Arabic
the
way
Arabic,
because
yeah.
like the word is Arabic.
I've now started doing that.
Whereas in English, I guess it would be Asa.
As yeah.
Slightly different, but you know, yeah. So, and I was just wondering, I guess, since working on the show and you know, sort of going deeper into those themes, has there been anything new that's come up for you personally, like listening to other people's stories and also reflecting on your own?
I think it's definitely the newest thing for me is collective grief. Um, and collective grief and shared grief. Because I feel like personally it's not something that I've done is share grief with people who are not who don't directly feel the same grief, if that makes sense. Um, like when my father passed, it was grieving with people who knew him and people who had that direct relationship and were like our grief is shared in that, and that's the linking factor, is being that like the relational link. So this has been the first time for me of like sharing grief where the people that we are grieving, we all have independent relationships to those people. And the common thing is grief rather than the relationship, which has been really interesting. To be like, you know, what are the similarities? Where, where are we feeling the same things, even though, you know, the way that we've come to grief is different. How is the way that we are living in it the same? That's been really interesting for me and really beautiful just to have. I feel like I've never worked on a show that's just felt so wholesome.
Yeah.
Because we all just like really hold space for each other and work to creating a space for safety, um, and a safe for kind of honoring what we are feeling, um, which I guess is another thing that I'm like learning or experiencing for the first time, is like a sense of reverence in the art that you're making, which I don't know, it's different from like other art projects that I've done in, I don't know, it's just, I don't know how to like properly articulate it, but there is a difference in, it's like it's almost blending like a creative project with like a emotional support group, which is something I have not done before. I don't know. I also like writing is usually a very solitary thing for me. Um, so maybe that's an element of it, is like I usually work alone. So it's been nice to, yeah, play with others and like really great artists and
I love
kind
that.
of share in that and make something together that we all really care about. I mean, we have done like a large body of the writing separately, but now we're kind of bringing it together, um, and like sharing it and seeing how it interweaves. Because I feel like the last like group thing I did was like slam, like a team slam, um, which
Very
obviously
different.
very different.
Yeah.
So I think that's like my frame of reference. It's like, oh, this is really nice.
I'll put the link to the show in the notes.
Yes, please do. Please, everyone come to the show. It's going to be beautiful.
It's in October as part
Yeah.
of Melbourne Fringe Festival.
Exactly.
So yeah, and I'm really looking forward to coming along as well. So is there, I guess, anything that you would like to, that we haven't maybe spoken about as much, or that you think you want to say?
I don't know. I don't think so. I think the next exploration's in the show, so come see the show. If it's not here, it'll be in the show.
Yeah, and I guess how can people learn, if people want to sort of find out more about you and your work? Where can they go?
Instagram is probably the best, probably the only source, really. I don't know. Everything I do is sporadically squashed across the entirety of the internet. But Instagram is probably the most centralized thing, where there'll be a link to everything through Instagram. It's like that's the entry point. Go to Instagram and then branch out across the web at Thabani.Tshuma.
Okay, cool. I'll put a link to that as well. And just to finish off, would you like or happen to have a poem to share, or would you like to share a poem? Or...
I mean, I always have a poem. I always want to share a poem. Is there a poem you'd like me to share?
Oh. I was gonna say something related to something that either around, I don't know, have you got a poem that relates to both addiction and loss?
Give me 5 seconds to consult the archives.
I'm putting you on the spot.
I feel like maybe, but isn't every addiction poem a poem about loss?
Probably.
There is one that I've been coming back to quite often recently. It's in my new book, which is out now. Buy while stocks last. But it's about music, and it's based off the song "Welcome to the Black Parade" by My Chemical Romance. There's the addiction element, but it's also about grief, because when I was like 16, my sister passed away, and then like not long after that, my sister, who's still alive, she got the Black Parade album by My Chemical Romance, and at the time I'd never listened to like punk rock. I wasn't a punk rock kid, but that album, because it is like the album as a whole, 10 out of 10 album, timeless, fantastic. If you haven't listened to the album, go listen to it now. But it kind of is about grief and about living with grief and dealing with grief. But yeah, it helped me kind of come to terms with grief, because I feel like that was like my first big grief that was like really close to me, and that album just really helped me feel the feels, and also tap into the rage. I feel like punk rock is good for that, is tapping into the rage of grief. Anyway, the poem is called G Note, because there is an iconic G note that starts the song that every emo kid punk rocker knows. So when you hear that you know, like you just know. It's over.
Oh.
Anyway, the poem goes like this. It's 2006. My only ambition is to own a PlayStation 3. I'm terrified of growing up. Pluto is apparently not a planet anymore. Small things have a way of being forgotten or reclassified. I've never owned a vinyl, but CDs were the vinyl of the time. My older sister says, you gotta listen to this. Allegedly, her taste is better from a place of grace or power or the need to flex. She lends me her boombox. We called them radios. And the Black Parade album by My Chemical Romance. Cue that G note. Cue spine tingle, halted breath, mouth as a gaping vacuum, rapid fire blinking. I just might cry. I am not yet a punk rock fan. Think I have just become a punk rock fan. Think life was incomplete before this band. I did not say stan yet, but in hindsight, stand that and understand the power of an instrumental procession, the howl of raging vocals, the divine ecstasy of anthems. It's 2008. Death decides it is time we get acquainted, arrives uninvited, lingers under their new name, grief. I play Welcome to the Black Parade on repeat. I cry, I cry, I cry. I stop crying. The song keeps playing. It's 2012. I search for a fitting subculture, learn how to ricochet between identities unnoticed due to constant motion in the pause. I question belonging, my hair too nappy for a fringe, my father's refrain, no son of mine will ever wear eyeliner, but my skin keeps me dressed in all black, and what could be more emo than that? It's 2018. What a band they were. The disbanded architects of our memories. We talk of how some songs are timeless. I gratuitously use the word eclectic to describe my taste. What I mean to say is I am afraid, and chaotic and soulful, rhythmic, psychedelic, enchanted, enchanting, guffawing, a teenage adult at odds with living, but so very much alive. It's 2020. She tells me it is a funeral song, agrees it is the sound of intravenous emotion. The tones linger in our marrow. We have always been dying. What a glorious thing it is to carry on. Love that piece.
So I actually read that before this morning.
That poem?
Yeah, because I was like, I was just like googling what poems you had out there, and I didn't necessarily want to like ask for a specific one, but
Yay.
I did read that one. And I was like, this is really cool.
Yeah, I do love it. I've been listening to that album recently because, like I said, I've been coming back to this poem often recently, and re-listened to the album, and it's so good. It's such a good album.
I think I need to listen to that album now.
You got it. It's fantastic.
I must admit, I haven't listened to the album.
It's a banger.
Okay. So thanks so much, Thabani, for this conversation. I think we covered quite a few topics, but sort of circled back in the end. So,
That's it. We love a non-linear journey.
Yeah. Just like life.
Just like life.
Grief.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like everything.
Thank you for having me. It's been lovely.
If you found this conversation valuable, then it would be great if you could leave a review or share it with a friend so that more people can find this podcast. Thanks for listening.